Hello, this is Michael Ellis along with Kimberly LaPointe, where we're engaging in these videos, a series on spiral dynamics, which looks at different stages of consciousness development in human history and in individuals. We've done two introductory videos, and we've done the first two stages, which were beige and purple. Now we come to the third stage, which is the called the red stage. And kind of what you need to keep in mind is, as Kimberly said in an earlier video, it's sort of like the boiling blood red sort of mentality that is expressed to some degree here in stage red. The different names for it, probably the most common name is the warrior stage. We've gone from survival stage to the magic tribal stage, and now we're the warrior stage. It's also called by some the egocentric stage because it's egocentric. As you will see, I think, as we go through this, a little bit of background on this. The red stage comprises about 20% of the world's adult population. Now, it came into being roughly about 10,000 years ago that it really began to be more prominent. And red can be found in people groups around the world, even today, various social groups that we might find ourselves in, and certainly in individuals in the individual development. It is one of those stages of human development that most go through. And remember this too, as we start letting the higher levels in, that it's not automatic that someone has to go to another layer, another level or stage. People can stay there. Like we looked at purple last week, and there are people that may choose. Life conditions may help to dictate this, where purple's just fine, and there's no need or no challenges to necessitate a move to even red. And it's true for red. Some people will be only that so far along in their development, and that's okay. But again, about 20% of the world's population is there currently. Remember too that in spiral dynamics, we see that the stages swing from a me-focused stage to a we-focused, and the pendulum swings from stage to stage to stage. The beige one, based on just absolute sheer survival, was a me stage. Just one's own personal survival was the whole focus of beige, just staying alive. Then we move to purple, which is a we stage, that tribal stage, where there's a very, very strong focus on the community of the tribe in particular. And then we're in red, you can predict we're moving back to a me stage. And it very much is a me stage. It is a me stage. And in fact, if you look at all the stages, I would say it's the most egocentric, self-centered me stage that we have, even though there may be some focus later on in that regard. We saw the me stage in beige, the we in purple, and now we come to the ego stage of the warrior stage of red. Here in red, we see the individual breaking out. They've been in this tribe, and everything's been about the tribe, and there's really not a lot of personal identity and self that we can see. There's a beginning of self that happens. We don't really see it very much at all in beige. Purple, we begin to see a sense of self, but it's really subsumed under the idea of the tribe, and the tribe becomes very, very central. But here we have a real advance in consciousness where the individual the individual self begins to come into being in a very strong, powerful way, and a dominant way that we will see here in a moment. So if you can imagine, let's imagine for a minute how red might be, what might necessitate red coming into being. So we have these tribes. We've got the chief, and we've got the elders, and they have just tremendous amount of authority. Now it's not kind of a dictatorial authority. They're very responsible with that. that authority, but they have it. And so at the end of the day, after all, when decisions have to be made, then they must be obeyed. And the whole focus is really on the whole tribe, and everybody's got their roles and everything else. Let's suppose that you've got a young man, and he is one of the warrior hunters that is in the tribe. And this guy's particularly athletic. He's really, really skillful in the hunting. He is actually superior to all the others in terms of his hunting ability. He actually takes greater risks than anybody else. He makes a bigger difference at the end of the day in his hunting skills in terms of the well-being of the whole tribe and helping to feed them. And so, you know, the thought may arise in them and over time is this: well, why am I only getting what everybody else gets when I'm making such a significant difference in terms of the outcome for the tribe? That my skills, my abilities, me makes a difference here. So we see in that thinking of a further differentiation of the self that's beginning to blossom into this third stage, the red stage, the warrior stage. Now add to that in this sort of historical development of one then beginning to question authority. Just wondered about the authority, and we've given them such a lot of sway over all things that are tribal. But let's think about that for a minute. You know, as this emerging individual may start to ask, well, what is that really all true? And maybe they start testing the limits in terms of the authorities, whether it's the chief or the elders or even the spirits, the traditions, the customs, all of those things, pushing against it a little bit and finding out actually maybe that they're a bit weaker than they had maybe even led to believe in terms of their upbringing, that they're maybe even more vulnerable than it seemed on the surface. And so there's a chink in the armor, if you will. Maybe I've got a place here. Maybe there's some strength that I have that they're really not exhibiting. And so they will contest these limits and find that they actually have some power in themselves. So we see the birth of the individual, the strong individual, who begins to think that they can take on anything, perhaps. And so in this, we see that birth of that individual, the birth of the self, that sees that they have their own capacity for authority and taking authority and taking leadership. And so it's a very forceful kind of a view of this next stage and what's going to unfold. So where does this go? Well, to kind of boil it down, the perspective of stage red is to express self impulsively and forget about everybody else. So it's really, as we said, very me centered. But it's about nobody else really counts. It really is me here. And so it's a huge shift in terms of egocentrism. So red is a very dominant, deeply self-centered stage. That's why it's called the warrior stage. Let's look at some of these traits of red, some of the key traits that you would expect to see in red. Now, in Beck and Cowan's book, Spiral Dynamics, these are the key elements that they point out. These aren't all the elements, but these are the key elements that demonstrate what red looks like. First is, in a world of haves and have-nots, it's good to be a have. What you don't want to be is a have-not, one that's left out of the loop here, but to be one that has, that these resources are beginning to be accumulated and flow toward this particular person. The second thing is that in red, you want to avoid shame, to defend one's reputation and be respected by all others. The third thing is one will, in red, gratifies their impulses and senses immediately. So the immediate impulsive gratification is the focus of red. And you can see that's going to set up some particular dynamics, really. So the next thing that is a dynamic of red is to fight remorselessly without any guilt when one breaks the constraints that they feel that they have. So when they feel constraints, they'll break them. They will do it with all the force that's required and not have any guilt or remorse about that. That's something we'll see that doesn't even come to the next stage in terms of guilt. So we have that as an element. Then we have the final one we're going to look at. Don't worry about consequences that may not come. So let's break these few elements down just a little bit more. In a world of haves and have-nots, it's good to be a have. The way red sees the world is it's a jungle out there, that it's dog eat dog, and the survival of the fittest is very much a red view. And red sees itself as the fittest, and so it's going to be able to survive, and it does that with all of their resources. So you've got to be the meanest, the most dominant figure in the world to survive. Red respects strength and abhors weakness, weakness in itself and weakness in other people. Because they see the weak as losers. These are the ones that you can dominate. These are the ones you can take advantage of. Worse than that, they not only disrespect the weak, they see them as prey. They're the ones that you can actively take advantage of. So as red, you want to be the predator, and everybody else becomes the prey. So what red does is it sees what it wants. Somebody else has got it. The weak have it, for instance. They see it, they go after it. Again, without any remorse, they just take that because they've got the power, they've got the strength to be able to take it from the weak, and they do it, believing that they deserve to have that and that the weak deserve to lose it because they're weak. It's easy to take from them. Why not? It's kind of what they're there for, in a sense. So the resources are seen by red to be limited. And therefore, to get what I want of those means to dominate other people that have that. And so they go and grab it. Now, if one resists red going after what they have, that this will be met with violence if necessary. Again, no compunction about this. It'll be violent. Whatever strength it takes to acquire what they want. So this is the world in red of the warlord, of the gang leader, of the mafia figure, to use some more extreme examples. We talked about stage purple. And when red begins to develop and they get into leadership, purple is often around them. And so purple is actually seen as prey into this predatory red stage. They are the fodder for the egocentric purposes that red has. So you can think of Saddam Hussein, for instance, where you have this incredibly red leader, and he's trying to lead all of these various purple tribes, and is really able to do that for kind of the force of his personality as a red leader. Red wants to be in control of the group. And what happens if you have more than one person in that group that have these red traits, you can expect a clash to happen. All right, so that was that first, being in a world of haves, you want to be, and haves not, you want to be a have. So the next one is avoid shame, defend your reputation, and be respected. Red sees itself, and pay close attention to these qualities. Red sees itself as strong, invincible, bulletproof, defiant, aggressive, forceful, and right. So in fact, for red, might makes right. These qualities, when you look at later stages, these are not qualities that later stages are going to likely look at and say, oh, that's what I want to be, okay? That would not see that as the qualities of a successful life. However, red looks at that, and these are desirable qualities through the red lens. To establish one's reputation in that is exactly what they're looking for. So red wants to be feared and respected, and will insist on that respect. To be respected is to necessities for supporting their ego. Now the egos now come into play, and in a big way, so the respect for that ego is very, very important. So in some ways, actually, the ego just coming online is kind of weak in its own way, and so needs this extra support. And red, being so oriented toward that, insist on that ego being supported by the respect of other people. To be disrespected for someone in red is a punishable offense. They do not cotton to being disrespected. So if a person in red is embarrassed or humiliated or defeated by someone else and exposed to be weak in any kind of way, that causes shame to come upon the person in red, which is the worst thing in the world for someone in red, to feel shame. It's intolerable for someone that's in red. And so if someone knocks a red leader off their pedestal, that action will be met with retaliation and revenge. Again, think of the mafia kinds of intrigues that may happen within a mafia group. Red, in fact, does not respond well to threats and will not submit unless there is overwhelming force. Now, that's something, just in kind of light of social events that are going on, to kind of keep in mind that we talk about, like the police and others that they are confronting, and we see these confrontations happen. So if you have police who are typically in blue, which would be our next stage, law and order stage, and you have someone that they're confronting and dealing with that's in red, and if they feel disrespected or challenged, or the police are using force, you can see where in this dynamic there can be a response that doesn't lead to good things at the end of the day. And we've certainly seen our share of all of that. We can see this pushback of not submitting to force, even in the world arena. Think, for instance, around the world today. Think of North Korea or Iran or Syria, where these outside pressures try to make them submit, and they just buck up against it and will bow up against it and fight it, even when the odds aren't necessarily in their favor. So threats can stoke this kind of defiance in red, whether a country, a group, or an individual. Now, the next element we want to dive a little deeper into is that one of gratifying impulses and senses immediately. Stage red lives in the moment and will justify, it has access to the past and the future, unlike beige does, but it's not where it resides. It looks at the past and it will justify things in the past, and it simply doesn't entertain any consequences for the future. They know that the future is going to come, but they're not thinking consequentially about that. They're thinking only about today. So whatever they desire at the moment, right now, is to be pursued, and pursued with all one's might and strength, all their influence. Red does not care what others think, and therefore it's not dissuaded by the opinions of other people. They get into blue, law and order, that might matter a lot to someone in blue. It will matter to them. But in red, I don't care what you think. It doesn't matter. That's not going to change anything of what I'm doing here. It's what I want right now in the moment. So stage red expresses itself now, and to use it colloquially, to hell with everybody else. Wants immediate gratification and has difficulty with impulse control in red. Relatedly, red has a very strong pleasure orientation and avoid pain. So goes for pleasure, avoids pain. But I thought about this element of the impulse control and being in the moment. One of the things that's always frustrated me as a football fan is, and one thing about sports, and some particular sports, we'll see these in our examples a little bit later on. We have a lot of people that actually are drawn to those particular sports because they're red. And one that draws a fair number of people in red actually is American football. And you can see why. The opportunity to go out there and hit people with as much force as you can legally get away with is attractive, perhaps, to red. But one of the things that's always frustrated me is you'll see a player, for instance, and maybe they are red for this reason, and somebody will say something to them at the end of a play, and they'll punch them, and they get the flag thrown, a 15-yard penalty for a personal foul. And you would think, okay, they got that, they've learned their lesson, and they keep doing it game after game after game. They get this flag for reacting to somebody doing something to them. And if you think of it through the red lens, if in fact that's what's going on in that individual, it makes a world of sense, because they're in the moment. They're not thinking about, they've justified the past, they had every right to do what they did. They're not really thinking about the future. It's just simply not on their radar. This is what's happening right now. So, a potential example of that coming to light. So another element of red is it fights remorselessly and without guilt to break constraints. Fight remorselessly and without guilt to break constraints. Stage red sees itself as right and everybody who opposes them as being wrong. Very clear to them. We're in the right. Why? Because it's my opinion. That's always right. I'm this strong one here. And everybody else that disagrees with that is on the wrong side of it. This stage is highly dualistic, seeing very, very black and white, and seeing things in terms of good versus evil. And of course, they're on the good side, no matter which side that is, theirs is going to be the good side. They're the good guys because they're the ones who are correct. So to oppose a red leader is to oppose God. And you will feel the wrath of God if you oppose them, and you will absolutely deserve all the wrath that you get. Whether red is taking from other people, the weak, whether it is exacting revenge on people that have disrespected them, of defending themselves with violence, of eliminating their opposition, of expanding their territory, or ruling with an iron fist, etc. These actions are taken to be completely justified by red. There's not a hint of remorse, guilt, or second guessing in red. All of that is completely justified to get what they want or to respond to someone else who's gotten in their way. It's actually interesting because as we think about this and look at it, we say, well, why don't they feel any guilt? I mean, it seems almost like, sociopathic or something. Well, the thing about the stage developments is guilt is not something that actually has developed at this stage. That's a stage blue development, as we will see in our next session. We see that these negative outcome, well, we'll get into more of that in a minute, but blue is a law and order stage and has an accountability to a higher power. Red hasn't developed this yet. It's not there in red to this point. So there's not that access to that kind of a guilt. So these aggressive and violent actions are simply meting out to people what they actually deserve. They asked for it, they got it. And kind of dovetailing with that a little bit is this next element we want to look at. Don't worry about consequences that may not come. Red has not yet developed consequential thinking. It doesn't think about the consequences that may take place for any of the actions that they take. And it may be difficult for us to realize that, but it just simply hasn't come online in the brain, in the consciousness of someone that is in red. Part of this is because they are not in time. It's just the now. Now, it was, you can access that briefly, but where they're living is actually in the now. So there's no remorse about things done in the past, no view toward consequences what may happen or may not happen in the future. There's only the actions that are taken in the present. Even if there are possible negative outcomes to an action, and those are actually enumerated. In other words, you say to a red person, well, if you do this, this is what's going to happen to you. That really is not registered for a red person. This is not because they see themselves as bulletproof. They see themselves as invincible, and those outcomes may not happen even though you say that they are. Therefore, they think that, well, it may not happen. Why do I need to change my behavior here? So these spelling out the consequences does not dissuade the impulsive, egocentric, tough, bold, and strong red from actually happening, for actually acting. So again, when we get to the blue stage next, we'll see that guilt comes online because it's the rise of civilized living with law and order, of delayed gratification, which you're not finding in red, of rewards and punishment, being able to think through those particular things. Red does not like to be constrained or kept down in any way. It will fight against that kind of constraint. So when we get to blue in the law and order stage and trying to bring order out of chaos that we see in red, with the police, they have the police and they have the laws, the regulations, the legal system, the prison system, all of these things. And red looks at that and it resents it because it looks like it is there to put them down and constrain them, and it kind of, in a way, may be. But they react to that. And so blue, using all these particular methods as maybe the go-to method, is actually going to be something that's going to be resisted by red, just by virtue of it being there. So again, looking at police, laws, regulations, legal system, prison system. And again, you might draw some parallels with what we see in contemporary life today and some of our social unrest in this, of red simply not liking that and reacting violently against it. So the blue system is based on being able to see and anticipate consequences which red cannot see. So punishment does not act as a deterrent to red. Not a deterrent. And though blue wants to use punishment as a deterrent, it really doesn't work well with red at all. So here's the thing about red, though. Now, blue's got its system. So when red actually violates the rules and the laws of blue, the consequences will, in fact, often come upon them. So they may end up in the legal system, may end up in prison. So prisons in America are made up of people that are largely in red, in a red environment, as you could fully expect that, therefore with little chance of rehabilitation, which all contributes to a very high rate of recidivism. People going back to prison over and over again, trying to use this one system to change the behavior in red, which will not be constrained by it. So when we look, this is why this learning about the spiral dynamics is really, really helpful to sort these kind of things out. It's got a very practical nature of learning about spiral dynamics. We might see in this that actually if the punishments don't work with red, what does in fact work with red actually is rewards. So it might require a bit of rethinking about rewarding the kind of behavior that society defines as being proper behavior, but maybe a better approach than simply a punitive one, which is kind of where we end up being. There probably are some instances, however, that somebody goes so far down red that they are a real serious risk to society, and therefore might need to be in prison to keep them from being dangerous to other people. So this is going to lead us to looking very briefly here at the learning style of red. It's going to be very different and from stage to stage to stage. Given the discussion above, the punitive and negative approaches are more likely to engender negative responses in red, that we maybe want to look at it differently. Learning for red best comes through immediate reward. So that you have a behavior and that's immediately rewarded and it reinforces that. If it's 2 weeks later, it's not going to have as much impact for success. And since red is not logic-based, but it's rooted in a somatic or body-based kind of intelligence or an emotional intelligence, therefore, red's learning style needs to be very much hands-on and active, which is why when we're dealing, say, with the inner city, where there are a pretty good population of youth that are in red, pretty high one because they're teenagers as well as being in red environments, that having ways for them to be active and hands-on is helpful. Things like, having sports teams that they can get involved in is very important for them, gets them off the street, get them into the gym, and that focuses them in a positive reward sort of situation. Red also learns best through people that they respect. And they respect people who are legitimized in their eyes. In other words, somebody who's been through something like they have, that can really relate to them, is how they can also relate to a particular leader, give them respect. So it's those kind of leaders that have been through what they've been through that can actually give them tough love, which helps actually shape them in a very, very positive direction. So for instance, ghetto kids can learn best from ghetto males who are healthy versions of red, or maybe even moved into blue. They can best respond to that because of the relatability they have. A couple of other final things, and we'll pass it over to Kimberly to talk about red and human development. Now, remember we said that red sees itself as tough and bold and invincible. And this can actually lead to a real sense of actually heroism and courage, daring and valor. Those aren't bad things, but you can see how they would be in red. In fact, one of the names that's given to stage red is power gods of those. So this kind of captures this dimension. Think of the mythical heroes of old, of legend, that are these red warriors that are going out defeating these enemies, these other strong leaders, but they're taking them down. That's the kind of heroism, the heroic view that red would have. And so reputation is so important to red. They want to, even if their reputation has to be in being a hero after the fact, suppose they meet their demise, yet they want to be remembered, their reputation to succeed them by being someone is seen as a hero that really went out in style, that really was not pushed down, was not taken down without a fight, those sorts of things. They want to be remembered with hero status, okay? And the final thing I want to talk about is leadership in red. Leadership is very dictatorial in red. It's you got the leader, and they call all the shots. They may have their lieutenants that have a lot of authority, but the leader's calling the shots. And there are a lot of people down at the bottom that are the soldiers, if you will. So they have ultimate authority. Again, think of the Godfather, for instance, as a model for that. And because order and bureaucracy are not in stage red, that's stage blue, and order and bureaucracy and systems for doing things are not there in red. They come in blue. What can happen is with red leaders, they may have all this authority in the world, but they don't run things very, very well. And so you've often heard that, to have a revolution is one thing, that'd be a very red thing to do, but then managing the country after the revolution is something that's another matter altogether. It may not be done well at all. And often red does not run things very, very well. There can be a lot of nepotism in red leadership, of corruption, of vice, ruthlessness, bribery, embezzlement, violence, retaliation. And so there's this, well, there's a great example of this, of a red leader in a country, and the U.S. or some other country sends a lot of, millions of dollars of foreign aid to them to help them out. And with the red leadership, I mean, it comes in their coffers, and they have all this vice and bribery and embezzlement. They just simply siphon it off in their own accounts, and then if they have to leave the country, they do, and do so happily, being filthy rich. And so that's a great example of how red can lead. And so when you have a country that has red leadership that's not moving yet into blue, you have a recipe for leadership that actually is crippling that country and its prospects. So what we would need to do is, rather than run them off or kill them off, is perhaps help those leaders to move into blue as best we can. So that's kind of the overview of the characteristics of blue. And Kimberly, you want to pick it up with some human development in stage red?
Yeah. So we talked about last time when we covered purple, that purple is the stage where children will spend most of their lives in that sort of mystical, magical, deeply connected place to their parents and to their caretakers and to their environment as a source of stability and thriving. But then, remembering going back to my first video about how personally we're always sort of living in this stacked place where we have, maybe most of our identity in one color, but we have parts or times in our lives where we're dipping in and out of other colors. And so throughout childhood, you're living mostly in that purple space, but you're starting to dip into establishing yourself as an independent, autonomous person who has feelings about, a sense of self and wanting things a certain way. The first sort of famous time that we think about this is in the terrible twos, or as most of us parents feel like maybe even the threes or worse. But really, for some kids more than others, it kind of comes and goes throughout childhood, these periods of really wanting to establish, a dominance or a testing of your authority. In American culture, it really comes to fruition, though, for most of us in the teenage years, where teenagers really come into a period of time where they want to question the traditions and the customs and the authority that they've been raised in. The warrior arises in a way. And it's an important part of development as teenagers start to prepare to make an emotional break from their parents and sort of figure out who they are and who they aren't. But it can be a really difficult time as parents and on relationships. So not surprising, right? Because we learned in purple that children view their parents as this almost sort of all-powerful being who can, conjure a solution to all their needs. They have almost a magical view of their parents, and you go from that to knowing nothing, in the teenage years. And so it's quite a steep and emotional fall for us as parents. But nonetheless, it's really important because it is the pathway for kids to kind of go through a pathway to future consciousness and development of a sense of ego and a sense of self. The healthiest among us who are sort of trying to foster kids is, to give them a little bit of runway to test those fences and test the limits and be very egocentric and exploring, what's good about that and what's bad about that in those times. But the key that keeps us all up at night is providing the guardrails so that relentless and guiltless pursuit of self-serving and pleasure doesn't, result in the type of destruction and harm to themselves and to others that certainly can be life ruining. So, you're trying to give them runway while not, letting them get sucked into things that are very, very difficult to recover from. And the good news is most of them really do make it through red and out the other side. But that's not automatic, and it's not to be taken for granted. And the original developer or person who really explored the philosophical theory of spiral dynamics, Claire Graves, had a quote that everyone has a right to be at the stage that they're in. And there are plenty of people, as Father Michael said, did you say 10% or 20%?
Yeah, 10%.
Yeah. Do sort of live their
20%.
lives arrested in a red environment. And so, some humans won't grow out of this phase. Now, that's a lot more likely if you grow up in a red environment in your home, or a red society, or red societal influences like, really challenging inner city environments like Father Michael was just describing, or within your home, if you have very red parents, this sort of because I said so authoritarian, rather than nurturing a sense of logic or reason or values, it's just because I said so, then, you can sort of be part of the influence structure that arrests people in red. So hopefully we're not doing too much of that. But in all cases, for even people who are in red, they, as well as the people around them, should be working towards just the healthiest version of that stage. And there are some, healthy versions, which we can get to in a minute. But first, we have a list of sort of examples, some of which from real life, some of which Father Michael's already mentioned, but also, some from popular culture and sort of icons that we think of when we think about this sort of relentless red. Somalia and North Korea, I think were both already mentioned. Boko Haram in Nigeria, warlords, Tony Soprano, and any kind of sort of mafia hero like Al Capone, pirates, the French Revolution, con artists, the Klingons of Star Trek, the arch villains in James Bond movies, West Side Story, Boys in the Hood, Tanya Harding, emperors, Caligula, is that how you say that? And Nero. We already said the mafia, online hackers and scammers, the Vikings, mass shooters, Genghis Khan, the Joker, lots of superhero villains, Jim Jones, David Koresh, Charles Manson, people who engage in sex trafficking or pimps, wild, sort of unrelenting rock star lifestyle, feudalism. Oh, Cersei from Game of Thrones, a real classic red example there. Honor killings, public beheading, the gladiator games, the industry of pornography, crucifixion, bullies, colonial expansion, sweatshops, slavery, the Wild West, the Terminator, Rambo, ISIS. ISIS is an interesting example because when you get into the exploration of spiral dynamics and sort of examples of it from around the world, there's nobody in the world that would give Saddam Hussein credit for much, but Father Michael mentioned that what he really did do was sort of control the infighting between the different tribes in Iraq. Now, he did that at a terrible toll because he was oppressive and he gassed his own people and certainly persecuted the Kurds and things like that. But he was also responsible for a certain amount of stability. And when that was lost, it did give power to just fractured red groups like ISIS. And so an interesting example there of not necessarily something to respect about red, but certainly a form of stability that can come from it. And maybe something to understand really well if you're going to try to disrupt that, as we did. Boxing, rugby, ice hockey, bull riding, bullfighting, cockfighting, dogfighting, pit bull ownership, bribery, bling, some forms of rap music, heavy metal music, Kanye West, many video games, graffiti, the KKK, the Black Panthers, lynchings, Carnival in Rio, war criminals, massacre, torture, cutting off body parts for intimidation or punishment, bank robbers, and the Crusades. So not a great list to be on necessarily. Which brings us to the next section of what we can learn from red. So we started this on the premise that there's important sort of rings of the tree that we're trying to gather as we move through each color. There's no question that red on its face is sort of the hardest to respect and the hardest to kind of be open-minded enough to find the good parts of it, because it is so associated with ruthless violence and gluttony and self-destruction. And so it is really, really hard, but nonetheless, it is an important stage of development that we have to go through. It can't be skipped. And, it is, the goal is to sort of move through it and get to a healthier place. So there are some qualities in red in which we do want to bring along. These qualities would include a certain energy and gusto for life. We might even say, in the best sense, that that energy brings with it an assertiveness and a confidence, right? So I was thinking, I did have my brother was a very red teenager, and he had this incredible ability to just stare through my parents. Whatever my parents were very logic, very kind parents, but no matter what they would sort of try to enforce or talk him through, he could just look right through them. I mean, as though he didn't even see them, and he could sort of go to a very stoic place. That was really, really challenging as a parent, but he took that with him. And then when he hit his orange phase and became really ambitious and an engineer and a CEO, he was really able to take that sort of ability to stonewall what other people thought of his ideas, and not really care. And that was something that he was able to turn into something productive. Now he was able to balance it with other, things along the way that, took away the sort of ruthlessness, but it's an assertiveness and a confidence that if you can hone it appropriately, probably can get you places in terms of commercial success. Anyway, it does allow for a certain amount of creativity and outside the box thinking. It rejects many of these sort of traditions and cultural rooting and ritualistic things that come out of purple. And it starts to say, well, what if we just don't? And it gives rise to some experimentation. It's our first taste of innovation. We get much bigger bursts of innovation in orange, but this is the start of that open-mindedness of being able to try something different. So that's something positive we can take from red. So, because we come out of that custom and that sort of tribal custom and magical ritual place of purple, and remember that we're about to really be constrained by the authoritarianism of blue. And so, it lets us really establish a little bit of experimentation in between. Being fun-loving and creative in pursuit of, some degree of selfish pleasure is something to hold on to somewhat, right? I mean, we all sort of struggle to make time for ourselves, to indulge ourselves in things that really bring us pleasure just for ourselves, to not be sort of sacrificing to our kids, our spouses, our jobs, our obligations. And so, holding on to some healthy amount of that is something that can be held on to in red, so long as it's not, limitless and destructive. And it tends to encourage us to be passionate about our pursuits and the things that we care about. So hanging on to that. In terms of the language of Christian transformation that Father Michael often talks about in his sermons, and we, when he talks about that sort of living the transformational life as Christians, it is that transformation and the balance between that transformational life and the ego and the false self. And if you haven't established that ego and that false self, then that's not an exercise that you're equipped to recognize and to be self-aware and to go through. So we have to have come through it again, not that we want to necessarily have the goal of arresting there or children arresting there, but you have to have come through it and know so that you can recognize about yourself, what you're trying to balance in that transformed life. So red is really important in that sense. So then we know that, we have those waves and they're overlapping, and we have these set of conditions that start to rise when we're in one color that can push us personally into the next. And Father Michael just talked about what some of those are at a cultural level, but at a personal level, red, one of the problems is that they're not terribly self-aware, and they're not particularly easily influenced by outside forces. And so, the thing that starts to happen that moves them to blue is that it's just not particularly a successful way to live. And so you start to sort of have this undeniable evidence that it's not working out well. You're not thriving. You're not surviving. In a way, you're exhausting your resources. You're exhausting your relationships. You're sort of cutting off your nose to spite your face type of thing. It's not successful. So they start to have doubts that that unbridled impulsiveness is really working out all that well. The other thing that can happen is the connection to other people. So you start to really care about other people close to you. You sort of remember that a more mature version of that connection to your parents. So now it's not because they're mythical, but it's because you start to have a more mature sense of love for your parents, or as you age out of the teenage years, a romantic partner, a spouse, a child, and that sort of pulls you out of that egocentric frame of mind. And they begin to realize that their behaviors hopefully are harming people around them, and they start to have that incentive to move themselves out of it. Maybe there's been enough cumulative punishment and disastrous effects of their behavior that it does start to break through. It's so extreme that the chaos becomes too much and it becomes undeniable. And I think that the best way that I've learned to think about it is that red, at both the cultural and the individual level, it just exhausts itself. It is so unrelenting and so resource using and so selfish and so destructive that it just can't sustain, because it exhausts itself, and you start to then look outside for structure, a higher order, a higher power, a sense of something else to take control, because you're so exhausted at trying to manage the chaos for so long. So in red leadership, even as an individual leader, as an organization becomes larger and larger, it becomes more complicated to manage by definition, and that authoritarian, powerful view, it can't extend to a large and complicated organization. And so the blue level, where we start to learn about sort of procedures and laws and processes and a certain amount of bureaucracy, as much as we all claim to hate it, we start to understand its function in giving us a framework for progress and functionality within a business. And so a number of organizational methods in blue can become really attractive. In the next session, we'll unfold stage blue, and the stage that brings us order and absolute truth, and probably the first one that a large number of us can start to really identify with sort of personally, either in our upbringing or where we are now. So that, I think, gets to be a little bit more of an interesting discussion.
Well, that's hopefully helpful in understanding red. And I think when Kimberly was asking me about the percentage, it was actually 20% of the world is in red. It's a huge number.
It is a huge number. Yeah.
Part of the world, and so it's something that is around the world. We deal with it in our politics. We deal with it in our social sphere in America. We deal with it in our communities and in our homes, and so it's important to know about it and those elements. And remember that no stage is a wrong stage. It's a bad stage. These are all important for development. It's always so important to be on the healthy side of these as opposed to the unhealthy ones. And so blue, I think you'll find, as Kimberly said, very, very interesting, because it's closer to home for most of us than these stages that we've gone through to this point. Let's remember that our focus here, from the words of St. Paul, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So good day, and God bless. Bye now.